calls, texts, emails, transactions, the list goes on. They say it's to keep us safe. A government-backed independent report into surveillance this week, called A Democratic Licence to Operate, says our privacy will be considered at all times in the collection process. What does that actually mean? And what's more important, personal privacy or national security? Do we have to sacrifice one to safeguard the other? Do text, call, email or use social media to talk to us? And Tommy will let us know later. Shami, there was a High Court ruling on Friday on the emergency legislation on the collection of bulk data, and they said it was illegal. What does that mean?
Well, it means that now Parliament is going to have to think again. The courts have rightly given the government and indeed parliamentarians time to reconsider what the legal framework should be for this kind of data retention. But I think that the most terrifying thing about this whole debate is whether you're with me or against me on the precise balance between privacy and security. We've not had the debate. The security agencies have been building their capacity and their practice to put us all under surveillance, not targeted surveillance of the traditional kind that we became comfortable with, but really surveillance of entire populations around the globe. And this has happened without proper parliamentary debate, let alone public debate, let alone law. And it's that lack of democracy and that lack of respect for the rule of law that is, I think, the most terrifying part.
So it's a lack of democracy, Peter?
Well, it is actually a huge increase in the power of the state, and it is a destruction of the presumption of innocence, which is the key to our liberty. People go on about democracy. Frankly, you can take or leave democracy, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't do us much good. It often leads to tyranny. But what really stands between us and tyranny is the rule of law, is jury trial, is the inability of the state to lock us up when it feels like it. And that's based on the presumption that we're innocent until proved guilty. Once the state has the power to poke into our lives as if we're guilty the whole time, that's gone. Our whole relationship with the state changes and its relationship with us changes. And these things are in fact, completely unproven. What you'll find, these enormously expensive security services, which we now have, which a country of our kind, in my view, shouldn't have at all, vastly expensive, have to justify the huge cost of themselves by claiming all the time they're protecting us against terror. They can never actually show that they've done so.
Or whenever they're challenged, they say, well, it's so secret. Terrorist plots that they wouldn't have been able to do had they not had the data.
If I tried to claim expenses from my newspaper on the basis that well, it's so secret, this, I can't tell you. I went to lunch with somebody, it cost 150 quid, but I can't tell you who it was or what I got out of it, they tell me to get knotted. And I think we should say the same to the security service. If you are really protecting us, show you're doing so. These vast organisations are actually a menace to our liberty. We're always being told that we're creating things called Britain's FBI. We're not. We're creating Britain's KGB. We should be very careful allowing these people to do these things at all. Surveillance should be directly targeted at individuals on a warrant signed by a minister responsible to Parliament. Under no other circumstances should they be probing into our private life.
If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear.
Well, absolute rubbish. And there are so many people who are scooped up by the state at airports. It happened during the early
nothing
stage
to hide,
of war
nothing to fear. This is the slogan that I've been listening to from every Home Secretary, practically, certainly since 9/11, and it's simply not true. The innocents have a lot to protect and to fear. Think of my friend Doreen Lawrence, now a national treasure, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, who years after her son's murder finds out that not only were the killers not under surveillance, she and her family were under surveillance instead. Why? Because they were embarrassing the police with their activism.
Angela, pick that up. Not only that as well, but they've been spying on human rights organisations like Amnesty and others. Why do that?
Why do that?
I don't care. I don't care if the state want to know when I pay my gas bill, if I pay my gas bill, who I pay my gas bill to. I believe very strongly in having nothing to hide. I was very happy to voluntarily get an identity card when they were introduced. I know they've since been junked, because I think the argument for the greater protection of the state knuckles all the other arguments about surveillance. We offer information about ourselves every day of the week. Every single person who has any presence on social media, who ticks the boxes at Tesco to say, yes, I'd like to hear about all the offers that you've got, who fills in any kind of form for a charity organisation, we voluntarily submit data about ourselves every single day of the week.
So it's our fault for giving it away
in the first place. It's not a question of fault, and this is why I get very, not with you personally, but I get very irritated about the argument about well, we have to have long and involved discussions questions about why we should be having it, should be having it. We live in extraordinary times where the threat of terrorist activity is at its height, and I think that I would much rather, if the state can be bothered to look at what I bought at the supermarket last week, if it in any way protects the country and protects me from any kind of terrorist activity,
Can I
go
put
ahead.
Something can I just
go and have a look.
I suspect that we're both feminists.
And I'm not. Well, no,
okay, doesn't matter. I suspect that we're both.
I believe in equality and human rights. I don't want to be labelled as a feminist.
Okay, forgive me. I suspect that we both believe that there's a lot of violence in the home. That lots of women and children have been abused in domestic dwellings over the years, all over the world. Do we agree about that?
Yes, but
would that justify placing cameras and microphones in every domestic dwelling on the basis that the innocent have nothing to fear?
Do you drive down a motorway where they have speed cameras? Do you walk through a street where there are CCTV cameras? We are monitored all the time.
We have to get this in proportion, though, don't we?
Well, but you're not getting it in proportion.
You don't have to like it.
You don't have to like it. We accept it.
To everybody who says if you have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear, I say, all right, then will you please send me all your medical records, your education records, your bank accounts, every single detail of your private life, and then give me permission to publish it. Everybody has.
I must admit, I think it's scary how much of our information is already out there, and I don't really think about it most of the time. But occasionally I did. I came across an extraordinary story the other day, and it was in the States. There'd been a murder. The police they had DNA, but they had no suspect. So they went to this ancestry website where people send in spit tests, and they tell you about whether you were descended from Charles II or whatever. And they used that to track a guy down. Turned out to be a journalist. They, you know, gave him a lot of grief.
So that DNA sample was
sample, they used it to try and find linkage. They found this
national
bloke.
Network.
And then they accused him of the murder. They gave him a rough time. Turned out to be utterly cobblers.
Would you think then we're being a bit complacent about the amount of data that we're giving away and is being collected? Because Tony Porter, who's the surveillance commissioner and was a former senior counter-terrorism officer, said the public was complacent about the encroaching surveillance and urged public bodies, including the police, to be much more transparent about
I think we just have
what they are
absolutely
doing.
No idea. I mean, I am very paranoid, and I imagine that any email I send will be read by someone at some point or be exposed. I would much rather not live in a world that was like that.
But you volunteer information about
you've had these instances
all the time.
You've had these instances of people who've been at airports, who've been mistaken for somebody else, who've vanished into a complete underworld where they aren't allowed to contact anybody where they're treated as if they're criminals for hours. In fact, in some cases for days and weeks until the authorities recognise they've got the wrong person.
Because your privacy, it's important in itself. It's part of intimacy and dignity and trust between people. But it's also essential to lots of other rights and freedoms too. You can't have a fair election without a secret ballot. You can't have a fair trial without confidential legal counsel. And even though sometimes we say that free speech and personal privacy are in tension, ask a journalist to give up their confidential sources and they'll tell you how dangerous that is and why they won't do it.
But is it snooping, though? I mean, that's the question. And where do we draw the line between personal privacy and national security? Is it possible to have a balance between the two?
There has to be a balance. There has to be a better balance.
And the problem is that we've got a kind of melting pot here of lots of different ideas of what we define as privacy or invasions of privacy by saying, would a journalist surrender confidential sources? Would you publicise my bank details on you know, in a newspaper? Obviously, I don't want somebody to access my money. But in terms of day-to-day, ordinary activity, for example, you know, if you travel to somewhere like Israel and you go to the airport, they're not interested in bottles of Lucozade and whether you're taking, you know, a lipstick on the plane. They profile you, and you're asked a lot of invasive questions. Now, people that aren't used to that will say, wow, you want to know who I'm going to see, where I'm going to stay, have I got any relatives there? But the threat of national security is so intense. I mean, I accept it because I would rather that
and
than
the
somebody
threat to our national security, Peter, is getting
in a
higher and
cafe.
higher, and therefore the level of surveillance needs to be greater.
I don't think there's any demonstrable proof of that. What we do the work of the terrorists over and over again. Governments and media do the work of terrorists by hugely overestimating the size of what they do and the power of what they do to disrupt us. In fact, they have very little power, and most of their power comes from the fact that we panic whenever they strike. And if we did less panicking and more thinking about terrorism, they would be less of a threat to us. If you really don't want terrorism, the simplest thing to do is absolutely straightforward. Don't give in to it. If nobody had ever given in to it, terrorism would have died out. The fact is, terrorism has been incredibly successful in the Middle East. The Palestine Liberation Organisation has risen to enormous power and strength on the basis of it, and the Irish Republican Army beat the British government to nuclear power in Northern Ireland because we gave in to that. So people look at the world and they think, well, if you can overthrow and defeat a major government with terrorism, we'll do it. If you don't want terrorism, don't give in to it, but don't take it out on the population.
All right.
Because you're so feeble.
OK. Tommy?
Most people are saying that they've got nothing to fear and therefore nothing to hide, but a lot of comments saying that they don't trust the security services with the information. Michael saying if the information they gather leads to saving even one life, then he's OK with it. Richard on Twitter saying security is also the reason given by totalitarian states for blanket surveillance. Warrantless data collection is privacy invasion. Peter on email saying, I feel strongly that our business should be our business and not shared at all. I, for one, do not wish to live in a big brother state. Davy Boy saying, anyone who thinks the powerful cannot access any of your private data if they want to is dangerously deluded. And Lee on Facebook saying, of course we trust our security services. We're all happy citizens who trust the spooks completely. Hello to the spooks.
That's brilliant.
Thank you very much, Tommy. I just want to pick up on the comment, Angela, about totalitarian states use surveillance, arguing that it's in national security, and isn't that the way we're going, where we're happy to give all our information to the state because we're so worried about what might happen to us?
Do it most of the time anyway. And against your argument, Peter, a lot of terrorist activity is fueled by social media and fueled by the kind of debating forums that people can find, exchange information, find out about, access to broader platforms to discuss these things. It doesn't matter. Look, it's a personal view. You can have any view you want. That's the beauty of free speech, as it is. But from my perspective, as a regular, ordinary person, not particularly high profile, I don't have a government position, whatever. I don't care what the state want to do about me and my personal domestic business.
You absolutely should, because
Okay,
by not caring, you actually help to destroy a heritage. We in this country, the people of the United States, all the Anglosphere countries, have an incredibly precious possession, because they've all got charters. In our case, the 1689 Bill of Rights. In America, their 1789 equivalent, which say basically don't trust the government. Never trust the government, always restrain it, never allow it to do anything beyond the absolute
minimum. It's not doing anything that
no, but in all those countries, those countries where that doesn't exist,
One last one from
the individual
Shami,
is constantly
Peter.
under threat from the state.
Okay, one last one.
It will.
What do you think about the environmental protesters, right? Not jihadis, just radical vegetarians who found that undercover cops had been living with them intimately as partners and fathers of their children for up to 7 years. That happened in recent times in this country.
Well,
that's what can happen to dissenters, how dissent in a great democracy like ours can be treated as suspect
I'm not
behaviour.
a dissenter. We talked about this idea of having nothing to hide, nothing to lose. I'm not a radical campaigner. I don't have anything that I think would in any way attract the authorities to track me in any way. And if they do, they really have too much time.
I just think there is a wider problem, which is the wider problem is the fact that there are a lot of hackers out there who could access our data, whether it is the government, whether it is Albanians.
My data.
Unfortunately, what they might do is hack into your bank account and remove all your money.